Hi everyone, my name is Andre Elmosnino Laufer and I'm a software developer at Valtech. I'm here today to talk to you about how we converted URPlay from a legacy Ruby on Rails app into React. Today's agenda, I'll start with the background, why we decided to move to React. I'll share our strategy and the different steps we took in doing this migration. I'll also share some ways of working that were working fine for us. And I'll end with some takeaways and resources that you might find useful. The aim of this talk, of course, I understand that not everybody sits on an old Ruby on Rails app, but I want everybody in general that have legacy apps to get some insights on how we can do this. But also keep in mind that if you do work on a super fancy modern app that is modern today, of course, it won't be modern for all future, and you might need to do some rewrite in the future. So this might leave you more knowledgeable for when it's time to do so. So who am I? I'm a front-end developer doing mostly React and Angular. I might also mention that I'm based in Stockholm, Sweden. I'm also the lead of our front-end craft circle at Valtech Sweden, which means that I arrange lunch lectures and workshops so all of our front-end developers keep up to date with the latest trends in front-end development. And some of the clients I've worked with include UR, which is what I'm talking about today, but also Goodyear Tires and Invidem, which is a Scandinavian business-to-business financial company. And on my free time, I love to bake sourdough breads. I teach kids how to code at Coder Dojo. And I also occasionally talk at meetups. This is me at React.js Meetup Stockholm, pre-COVID, giving a shorter version of this talk. So on to the background. If you're from Sweden, you know what UR is, but I guess most of you aren't from Sweden. It is the Swedish educational broadcasting company, and is part of the National Public Service Broadcasting Group. And in essence, they produce and broadcast educational and general knowledge programs. And URPlay is what you see on the right here. You can sort of see it as a Netflix of educational content, mostly videos, but there's also a lot of podcasts. So why did we choose to go to React? In early 2019, the situation was the following. We had a Ruby on Rails monolith that was about 4 or 5 years old. There was a lot of jQuery magic going on. You didn't really know how things happened. There was also a lot of not only IDs, but also CSS class names, not just used for styling, but also for tracking and testing and functionality. So when you just wanted to change the DOM a little bit, or you saw that the class name didn't really make sense, you didn't really know what you broke and for who you broke it. There were, of course, some tests, but the coverage wasn't amazing. And there had also been some staff over during the years. There were a few consultants that came and left, and there wasn't a big focus on collaboration. So chances were that if the person who wrote the code wasn't there anymore, that nobody really knew how it worked. And it turned out that there was actually a bunch of code, at least, that wasn't even used anymore. And at least in Stockholm, back then and still today, it's hard to recruit Ruby on Rails developers. And I mean, we're all here at the React.js Case Study Festival because we love React and we want to work with modern technologies. And one of the major reasons for this migration was that UR decided, instead of having 2 different websites, which they had back then, there was one aimed for schools, which was UR Skola, and one aimed at the general public, which was UR Play. And instead of maintaining 2 different code bases with similar but not exactly the same functionality, it was decided to make it into one platform that would cater to the needs of both user groups. And I might also mention that it wasn't an exact one-to-one rewrite. We did add some new features. We implemented a new visual identity, so some new brand colors and so on. And this is what it looked before the migration. And this is what it looks like today. So it's sort of same, but different, as they say. Pretty similar, but some new functionality as well. Over to the strategy. we started with what I call the setup phase. So there are a few so-called Ruby gems available to have React running in your Ruby on Rails app. One of them being React Rails, and we wanted to make sure that it catered to our needs, that it worked for us. So we made a small proof of concept, made sure that we could use TypeScript and run the test, and that it had a good developer experience, which it had. So then we started writing all of our end-to-end tests. We went for Cypress because it's a great tool. We knew it and we had worked with it before, so that's why we went that way. And we made sure to cover all of the happy flows and the most critical features. Let's say that a user could actually search for programs, that they could play them, that they could browse, and so forth. And that way we could feel confident that nothing broke when we removed some code or made some swapping from Ruby on Rails to React, that everything still worked as expected. Then we did some setup. Of course, we wanted our own TypeScript configuration. We needed to make sure that Jest ran. We had some Babel configuration and so on. But we did that as a team to have a configuration that we were all happy with. Then we had a whiteboarding session, and this picture doesn't really show it that well what we agreed on. It's not so nice, but I just want to prove the point that we had a whiteboarding session and to agree on the project and file structure and to have a common vision and a strategy of how to do this rewrite, which we had. And I mentioned Cypress. In case you haven't used it, this is what it looks like in action. It basically opens up, you can do it, of course, headed or headless. This is headed, then you see the browser in Chrome. You can choose to do it in Firefox or Microsoft Edge as well, if you prefer. And it is also recommended, of course, to run it in different browsers to make sure that all of your users can use your app. And then, of course, you write your Cypress tests. You make sure that you have tests asserting that you can do all the things you want. And we liked to say reactifying. That's our way of saying turning it into React. So the steps are pretty straightforward how to migrate to React with the help of Cypress. First of all, you attach data-sci or data-e2e, whatever you choose, on your HTML markup. And the great thing with Cypress is that it's tech-agnostic, so you can use it in Ruby on Rails, you can use it in Angular or React apps, you name it. And then once you have them added, of course, I should also mention that the selector should be unique. So it could be data-e2e product card or search input, for example. Then you write your tests. You make sure that you have coverage for all your features and so on. And then you start swapping out components and do your conversion. And I should also mention, as a bonus tip, to use one of the many great plugins that exist for Cypress. There are a lot of them that are community maintained. There is one called Cypress Acts, which we used. You can run it locally or in your CI/CD pipeline, and it will fail your test and, of course, also your build if you introduce any severe accessibility violation. And this helps you ensure that your site is accessible for everybody. And it was one of the tools that helped us get a 100% score in Google Chrome's Lighthouse audit. So onto the implementation phase. We went component by component, and we made React grow and take over the page by growing up, down, or sideways. And I will illustrate here with an example. This is our search results page. In this case, the user hasn't searched for any particular query or any show. So it's just showing all programs and series. And we started with the little box that I marked with a number 1. It's a drop-down, it's a filter, and it says all education levels. And initially, we would just pass in the props directly from React Rails into our React component. And it would be an array of all the different options, basically. And once that one was in React, we could reuse the same component for the other drop-down filters. So for the one next to it saying all languages and so on. And each of them in turn would get their props from Rails into React. And once we had them all in React, then we could just wrap them in a container, and we would have one single point of entry in our code for the props coming in from Rails into React. And so that way we grew it sideways and to the right. And then we made our component grow to the left and take over that toggle that you see marked with a number 3. And it's a toggle between either showing just programs or entire series. And that, of course, would also get its props from Ruby on Rails, which would say the number of available programs or series. And then finally, we would grow upwards, taking over the header. In this case, because we haven't done any particular query, it just says all programs and series. But if you had searched for, let's say, Pinot, one of our favorite shows, then it would say all results for Pinot. So it would be kind of dynamic. And then, as you can imagine, then all of the top of the page was in React, and then we had it grow downwards as well. And you might wonder, where did we start? Like, where did we choose to turn from from Rails to React? And for us, it was generally when our experienced team, our UX and designers, would have suggestions on improved design and change it, or if it was entirely new features, then instead of doing it in Rails first, then we just implemented it directly in React. And from time to time, there wasn't anything that was prioritized to be turned into or a new design. And in that case, we would go to the pages that we had a lot of React and make React take over more and more of that page. So I've mentioned React Rails a few times, and this is how it looked like. In your Rails template, basically your HTML, you would call React component. And as the first argument, you pass it the name of your component, in this case, hello message. As the second argument, you pass it an object of all of your props, and it can take any amount of props and all JavaScript primitives, like Booleans, strings, arrays, you name it. And then the third argument is the options. In this case, we're passing it pre-render true. There are a bunch of different options, but this is one example that we use frequently. Pre-render true makes your component server-side rendered. So it will render once on the server, once it arrives in the client. And if you've done server-side rendering before, you know that there's no window on the server. So you cannot call anything on the window or so there. And therefore, you need to guard for it in your React code. Okay, so our hello message component, this is how it looks like in React. You import React as you always would. We love TypeScript, so we declared our types and interfaces. In this case, we say name is a required string. And then in the end, in the bottom, we declare hello message, and we destruct name, and we display an H1 saying hello name, in this case, hello Andre. And although this is just a simple example, if this would be something more complex that we needed to assert with Cypress with our end-to-end tests, then we would add a data-e2e, let's say, header on the H1 to still be able to assert that our header works as expected. And of course, everything has its downsides, and React Rails has some too. It is a great tool, first of all, but the downsides. It hasn't, last time I checked at least, been maintained since July 2020. As far as I know, there aren't any major issues or bugs with it. We haven't faced any, at least. But just keep that in mind so that you have a plan, if you want to move to React Rails, that you have a plan to proceed from there to some other technology, which I'm getting into soon. Because, I mean, you don't want to go to another outdated system. Documentation, it's okay, but not amazing. When you Google or look through the issues, you find solutions to most of your problems. But it's not amazing. I just want to mention that as well. But pretty much is being explained in the docs. And then major downside, I would say, is that there's no code splitting out of the box. Luckily for us at UR, it wasn't a huge app with hundreds of pages or so we didn't really have a big issue with this. But you're just shipping one bundle, and it will become larger over time. So it means, in essence, that you always ship a lot of unused CSS and JavaScript, and your site will be slower over time. Of course, it can be cached and so on, but it means that you're shipping more over the network than you should. And it also means that the browser needs to parse all that JavaScript and CSS unnecessarily. And so this is an example of the start page that I ran a few weeks ago. And as you can see, about 72% of the JavaScript was unused, and about 88% or 87% of the CSS. We were just shipping unnecessarily big amounts of code. And it was more or less the same picture on every page. And of course, you have to mention state and data. And as I said, it wasn't a very complex app. We didn't really need any app-wide state, anything shared. We didn't have a login, for example, for various reasons. But when we needed to have data, when we server-side rendered, we passed all the props from Ruby on Rails into React. And those in turn would be coming from our Rails views, and they would fetch data from our API and the CMS. Sometimes we needed dynamic data. For example, then we used something called a backend for frontend pattern, abbreviated as BFF. You might have heard of that before. And that's how we fetch data in React. And the BFF, in turn, will go to the CMS or to the API and get its data. And let me illustrate with an example. This is in our header. We have this search bar. If you click on the search icon, you will have it expanded and it shows an input. And it's a debounced search with auto suggestions. So let's say we search for our favorite program, Pinot, and it will show us a list of the most popular series and programs matching our query. And of course, that's something you can't really server-side render, so you have to fetch that data dynamically. And that's when we use the BFF. And also, we decided to use the URL as our state, as our single source of truth. The reason being that you can bookmark it, you can share it, you can refresh the page, you can go back and forth in history pretty easily. And the cases when we needed the URL as the state would be mainly on our search result page, because we added all those filters. Let's say we filtered on a specific language or so, we would add it in the URL. And on to the third phase. I said that you might not want to stay too long in React Rails. We had pretty early on saw a need for something like Next.js. It's a great framework. And I should also mention a disclaimer that I'm not part of the team anymore. So this is reported by my colleagues who are still on the team, how they did and why they did migrate to Next.js. So first of all, it has route-based code splitting, which will significantly reduce your load times. So it's great for the user experience, but also for SEO. And as I mentioned, there's about 70 to 90% of unused CSS and JavaScript per page. So we're shipping way less code. And also another great feature, if you haven't used Next.js, is that it prefetches all the links in the viewport, and it makes your app feels like a single page application. There's no flicker. And what happened to us when we had React Rails and React running inside of our Rails app, specifically with that larger bundle size, that the app became pretty slow. It could take a second or two or so for it to render the new page. So you saw actually a white flicker, which wasn't that nice. And of course, it has lazy loading of images, making you load less code than you need, and makes it faster as well. So the different steps of turning to Next.js. First, they created a new repo, a brand new Next.js app. Then they decided to go with the most simple pages. So, for example, there's one, the child lock page, and there the user could set the PIN code to make sure that kids that were using the computer couldn't see inappropriate content. And then they copied the end-to-end tests for that particular page to the new repo. Of course, it would fail because there wasn't any such page implemented. So it's sort of test-driven development with end-to-end tests. And then they copy-pasted the code for that particular page and went through all of the CSS and JavaScript. Because we had done some redesign over the 1.5 to 2 years that it took to do this migration, there was some CSS that wasn't used. And when we started the project, we used class-based components in React. And over time, we started using more and more hooks. And thus, they went through all these classes and turned into hooks instead. And then in Next.js, there's something called getServerSide props. It's a method that you can call to call the API or the CMS to get any data that's needed to server-side render your page. And then there's also the -API folder, which is basically an Express app. And through that, we would fetch data dynamically that would previously be fetched from the BFF. For example, I showed you the search input that is doing a debound search with suggestions. That would instead be done through the API folder, which in turn would go to our API or CMS. Then once the whole page would be in Next.js and the end-to-end tests were passing, then they did a redirect in the proxy. So any request that would go to /childlock would instead of being directed to the old Rails app, it would be redirected to the Next.js app per route. So I promised to mention some good ways of working. We did a lot of mob programming. This is what it looked like. We had a big screen and a common computer. We shared a keyboard and a mouse. And we frequently also invited our UX and designers and analytics to work with us. Sometimes you might get a design, it might be that you feel that they didn't think through something, or you see ways to improve it, or things that might not be clear. So that's typically when we invited them to sit with us. And then also you might notice on the right, a big whiteboard that was very useful for our whiteboarding sessions when we had complex issues to solve. You might also notice on the screen, there's an app called YourMobster that I built on our Lab Fridays. And it helps you keep track of whose turn it is and make sure that you rotate every 10 or so minutes. It also adds a break every, well, how often you like it, but we had a break every hour. So we stayed fresh and awake. And if you're not mode programming, you should try it, and you can download YourMobster as well. And of course, there are some pros and cons with mode programming. One of the pros being knowledge sharing. So instead of having one person that wrote all of the code knowing everything, and then that person leaves, then with mode programming, everybody knows a little bit about how everything works. It also helps facilitate onboarding. So if you have new team members, they won't be in a struggle. They just jump into the mob and start delivering directly. You also don't have to spend time, as I say, ping-ponging pull requests. Typically when you open a pull request, you get some feedback, then you have to wait for some time until that person gets back to you and so on. Sometimes it can take a long time, but when you're mobbing, then you don't have the need for that. So it saves you time in a sense. And also for us, some of my colleagues were great at Ruby on Rails, and some were great at React. And together we could solve most problems, and we had all the skills we needed together. It is, however, a bit frustrating when everybody feels lost, when you have this really strange bug or something that happens very randomly or seldom, and that can be frustrating. In general, also, it can be pretty energy draining to sit together and talk all day long and being focused and being nice to each other. You feel kind of energy drained in the end of the day. And then, in my opinion, some tasks don't really fit for mobbing. For example, pixel pushing or doing some, copy paste tasks doesn't really feel like it adds a lot of value to sit together, 4 to 6 developers and doing it together. And some other useful ways of working, we decided that if 2 or more people worked on something together and they felt confident about it, that we didn't need a pull request, or we had a pull request, but you didn't need a review. Just save time. And then we decided also that sometimes we needed to add new features. For example, we wanted to add an infinity scroll on our search results page. So instead of doing this evaluation and labbing all together as a team, we went maybe one by one, did some evaluation, did a proof of concept, and then presented it to the rest of the team. And then we agreed on what to choose. We also had some smågodis, which is Swedish for small candy. And it's basically, imagine we're sitting together as a mob, all of our front-end developers, and the experience team would find something that needed to update the copy, something was wrong, or the font size would be wrong somewhere. They just spotted these small things that you can do in a few minutes or so. They would park it in a column in Jira, or, well, you can use whatever platform you're using to track your tickets. And they would mark it as small candy. And those were the tasks that some days, let's say you were too tired to mob program, or you came in early in the morning, or you're waiting for your tests to pass or build to pass or whatever. Then you could just grab one of these candy tasks and do it by your own. We had a similar concept of dev stories. So for example, sometimes we were working on a feature as a mob and we saw that some component didn't have a lot of tests or enough tests, or we saw some other kind of room for improvement or technical debt that wasn't really in the scope of what we were working on at the time. So we marked it as a dev story and parked it in the dev story column. And then as well, first of all, if it was a small one, we could grab it again in the early morning or so, or if you didn't want to mob. But also, instead of just adding to the technical debt, which is what most teams tend to do, we decided to keep on reducing it systematically. So every sprint, we as developers decided which one of them we want to tackle. So every sprint, we just kept on reducing our technical debt all the time. I also recommend that you use a PR template if you don't already. That way you make sure that the time you're not there anymore in the team, that the rest of the team can follow the code and understand why you did certain things or architectural decisions and so on. And also by having a checklist, you can make sure that, first of all, for example, that your site is accessible, that you maybe run, that you add the end-to-end test that runs an accessibility check, or that you try it out with just by navigating with a keyboard. You can also, for example, make sure that you always add tests for new features, that you don't forget it, because, well, we're human, we forget it. And then as well, things just like hygiene factors, like that the tests are passing, that the linter is passing, instead of trying to commit it, and then you wait for it to build. Sometimes CI/CD isn't that quick. And instead of failing 15 minutes later, you can just run it locally quickly, make sure that it passes, and then you know that your build will most likely pass. Also, do follow the Boy or Girl Scout rule, which means that you always leave the campsite nicer than you found it. So if you go through some code and if it's just a quick fix that doesn't belong to the technical debt thing, but it's rather like, for example, that you see a variable name that's unclear, where you could make things more dry, then just do it. And then we did have frequent user tests, and we front-end developers could join in on those as well to get insights into what our users needed and how they perceive things. Because after all, we do love to code, but we don't do this just because of the love of coding. We are coding to solve end user problems, so don't forget about that. And then we did have one design sprint. If you haven't tried it, you should, if you have the need of it, of course. If you don't know what it is, you should Google it. But in essence, for example, the time we had it was when, as I said, we were merging 2 different sites. the school site for education, and the one for the general public. And we needed to make sure that our program page, where you actually watch the show, catered to the needs of both. So the school users, let's say the teachers that needed some teaching material and some other metadata available, we needed to cater to them, but on the same hand, we didn't want to clutter the page with things that aren't useful for the general public. So we gathered around the whole team for a week and worked on this together. The front-end developers, the UX, the designers, copywriters, and made sure that we did a few prototypes, clickable ones, and tested them on real users to get their insights and to determine if we were solving their problems. Finally, some takeaways and resources. First of all, start with your end-to-end tests. You will feel way more confident when you start removing things. You know that everything works as expected. And there's not only end-to-end tests, we did have a lot of unit tests as well in TypeScript. And even though you have a plan in the beginning, you will do some refactoring and moving things around. And when you have that in place, then you know nothing gets lost in the way. You know you always pass the props that you need and so on. Also, to avoid the problem we had in the beginning with IDs and CSS classes being used for everything, be very explicit. Like CSS class names should only be used for styling. And then you use data dash whatever instead of IDs. So for example, if it's tracking, you add data dash track or TRK or whatever you agree with in the team and with your analytics people. For end-to-end tests, you add data dash E2E and whatever. That way you know that if you want to remove a piece of code, you know what it's being used for and who to ask. If it says data dash track, then you can ask your analytics team if they are still using it or not. If you don't already, then do use a CSS constants file where you declare all of your colors, font sizes, and so on. And we had one, but it wasn't always used. So we found a lot of variations on our headers. We found about 50 shades of gray and a lot of mismatch. So it wasn't always consistent. So this way, first of all, you have consistency. It gives a much more professional look of your site when it's consistent. But also the day when you want to change your theme, you just do it in one place and it will hit everywhere. So it's way easier. And also do take this time to go through your media queries and colors. We found a lot that wasn't used anymore, but also our media queries didn't really make sense. We had, I believe, a dozen or so, and they didn't always play nicely together. So some would be up to a certain breakpoint and some would be below a certain breakpoint. And it didn't really play nicely together. So instead, go through your design system, make sure that it's consistent, and do it well from the beginning. Then do have reuse in mind. Of course, you can't plan for everything, but make sure to think out your components, how you structure them, and so on, that you can reuse them. For example, when I showed you the drop-downs in the search results page, that we could just reuse the same component for different drop-downs, and we had the tests and all that already set up. So in the beginning, it took us quite a lot of time mobbing all of these little components, but once they were in React, it was way easier to scaffold an entirely new page in React. So it went way faster over time. And only add things when it's needed. For example, we didn't go for Redux because we didn't see a need for it. But a lot of times you see a lot of templates and so on that features all the bells and whistles. And in the end, you're just shipping more code than you need to. And you're also adding complexity where it's not really needed. I mean, you don't want to add too much of a learning curve to newcomers to your project. And speaking of Redux and state management, please only, if possible, handle your state in a single way. I worked in a project where there was Redux, there was MobX, there was session storage, and there was even the URL being used as a state, and it was being modified with jQuery. You can imagine that it was a mess. It wasn't nice to work with. You couldn't really do time travel, debugging. You didn't know what you had in state and where you had it. So if possible, please just use it in one single way. It will make your life way easier. And do try mob programming if you have enough people on your team. Do that. You'll have way better knowledge sharing. You mitigate the bust factor. So if someone leaves the team for whatever reason, then people can still work on it and understand why things are being made and so on, instead of just one person keeping all the knowledge in their own head. Also, by doing it this way with component by component, we avoided this big bang release that will probably just be delayed and delayed because, well, things are never ready. No software is ever completely done after all. So this way we managed to continuously ship improvements, new design, new feature to our users, instead of having the site locked down for a few months and having them wait for it. And then, very importantly, don't forget to collaborate across disciplines. People tend to think in waterfalls or making assumptions. When you don't know or you don't understand how your sketch should be implemented or how they thought about it, invite them. Make sure to ask them. That's something we do a lot. We work across different disciplines, and that's when you deliver the best solutions for your users. After all, don't forget that they're who you're building your site for. So I mentioned I'll share some resources. My slides will be available for download. Here are some of the technologies that I've mentioned during this talk. And that's about it. My email is right here. If you want to ask me any questions or give me any feedback, welcome it. Feel free to reach out. I hope that you've learned something new today. And that's it. Thank you very much.